Before we begin, take a moment, not to prepare, but to arrive. This is not just a story about history. It is a story about belief, power, and what happens when a single voice refuses to stay quiet. You do not need to know anything about Jeanne d'Arc to listen to this. You only need to be willing to sit with discomfort, because this is not a tale of simple heroism. It is not a clean legend. It is not a moral lesson wrapped in certainty. It is the story of a teenage girl who claimed divine authority in a world built to silence her, and of the systems that decided she was too dangerous to survive. As you listen, you will hear about faith and war, about courage and cruelty, about conviction and consequence. You will hear about a girl who became a symbol and what that symbol cost her. This podcast does not ask you to admire Jeanne d'Arc. It asks you to look at her, to see what we do with belief, to see how power reacts when it is challenged, to see what happens when certainty refuses to apologize. Listen slowly, listen openly, and if at any point you feel unsettled, know that this story is doing exactly what it has always done. Let's begin. Jeanne d'Arc was born into a world that had already decided her fate long before she took her first breath. She was born around 1412 in a small village called Domremy in northeastern France. It was not a place of power or education or ambition. It was a borderland village, constantly threatened by violence, raids, and shifting political control. France at the time was not a unified nation in the modern sense. It was a fractured, exhausted land, torn apart by the 100 Years' War with England and by internal conflict among French nobles themselves. To understand Jeanne d'Arc, you must first understand fear, the kind of fear that becomes ordinary. In Domremy, fear was part of daily life. Fear of soldiers passing through, fear of crops being destroyed, fear of forced loyalty to one side or another, fear of God's punishment, fear of hell, fear of women stepping out of line, fear of the unknown. Jeanne grew up illiterate. She never learned to read or write. Her world was oral, stories told by parents, sermons heard in church, rumors whispered by neighbors, and above all, the language of faith. Medieval Christianity was not gentle or abstract. It was vivid, terrifying, intimate. Heaven and hell were not distant ideas. They were destinations you could almost see. From a young age, Jeanne was described as deeply pious. She attended church often, confessed regularly, and was known for her seriousness. But this alone did not make her unusual. Many children in medieval villages were devout. What made Jeanne different was not that she believed in God. It was that she believed God spoke back. Around the age of 13, Jeanne claimed to experience her first vision. She said she saw a great light, and within it appeared Saint Michael the Archangel. Later, Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret would also appear to her. These figures did not simply comfort her. They instructed her. They commanded her. They told her that she had been chosen for a mission to save France, to support Charles VII, and to drive the English out. This is the moment where history splits into multiple interpretations. Was Jeanne d'Arc divinely inspired? Was she experiencing psychological visions shaped by trauma and religion? Was she consciously constructing a narrative that gave her power in a world that offered her none? The truth is unsettling. We cannot fully separate these possibilities. What we do know is this: Jeanne believed absolutely in what she experienced. And belief, especially absolute belief, is a dangerous force. At 13, Jeanne did not immediately act. She listened. She waited. The voices returned again and again. They grew more insistent. They told her she must leave her village, that she must find the Dauphin, the uncrowned king, Charles VII, and lead France to victory. This alone should stop us. A teenage peasant girl with no military training, no education, no social standing, believing she had a divine mandate to intervene in international War and royal politics. In medieval society, this was not just unlikely, it was impossible, and yet Jeanne did not doubt herself. What's crucial here is not whether the voices were real, but how Jeanne framed them. She did not say, "I think" or "I imagine." She said, "I know." She spoke with certainty. She spoke with authority. She spoke as if she had already stepped outside the rules that governed women, children, and peasants. That certainty terrified people, and it also attracted them. By the time Jeanne was around 16, France was desperate. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled large portions of French territory. The Dauphin's claim to the throne was weak. Morale was collapsing. Prophecies circulated among the people, prophecies about a virgin who would save France. Jeanne would later be folded neatly into these prophecies, but at the time, she was just a girl knocking on doors. When she first approached local officials and soldiers, she was mocked, laughed at, dismissed. She was told to go home, to spin wool, to behave like a proper girl. She did not. She persisted. There is something deeply unsettling about Jeanne d'Arc's refusal to accept no. In modern narratives, we often romanticize this as courage, but in her own time, it was perceived as arrogance, madness, or heresy. And yet, the doors began to open. Not because people suddenly believed her visions, but because France was running out of alternatives. Jeanne's story does not begin with glory. It begins with disbelief, ridicule, and resistance. It begins with a young girl standing at the edge of power, insisting she belonged there, and history reluctantly began to listen. Jeanne's journey toward power did not begin with triumph. It began with scrutiny. When she finally managed to secure an escort to take her to see Charles VII, the so-called Dauphin, it was not because anyone fully believed her. It was because the situation in France had become almost unbearable. Orléans was under siege. If it fell, the English would effectively control northern France. The court was fractured, paranoid, and desperate. Desperation has a way of lowering barriers that faith alone cannot. Jeanne traveled to Chinon, where Charles's court was located, dressed in men's clothing. This detail matters more than people often realize. In the medieval world, clothing was not merely fabric, it was identity, hierarchy, morality. A woman wearing men's clothes was not just improper, it was sinful, suspicious, and potentially criminal. Cross-dressing was associated with deception, witchcraft, and rebellion against God's natural order. Jeanne claimed her voices instructed her to dress this way. Already she was placing divine authority above social law. When she arrived at court in early 1429, she was met not with awe but with skepticism. Charles VII was cautious. He had been surrounded by traitors, false prophets, and political manipulators for years. A teenage peasant girl claiming divine guidance was not immediately convincing. According to later accounts, Charles attempted to test Jeanne. He hid among his courtiers, dressing as one of them, while another man sat on the throne. Jeanne, who had never seen him before, reportedly walked directly to Charles and identified him without hesitation. Whether this actually happened or was later embellished, the story became central to her myth. It painted Jeanne not only as divinely guided, but as someone who could see truth beneath appearances. A dangerous quality in a royal court built on performance and illusion. Still, Charles did not immediately trust her. Jeanne was subjected to theological examination. Clerics questioned her relentlessly about her visions, her beliefs, her obedience to the church. This is important. Before she was allowed anywhere near the battlefield, she had to be declared spiritually safe. This was not protection for Jeanne, it was protection from her. The church needed to ensure that she was not a heretic, not possessed, not a political liability. And Jeanne remarkably passed these examinations. She answered carefully but confidently. She did not contradict church doctrine. She insisted that her voices came from God, but she also emphasized her loyalty to the church, at least, as an institution guided by divine truth. This balance, obedience paired with unshakable certainty, made her both acceptable and terrifying. Eventually, Charles allowed Jeanne to accompany a relief force to Orléans. This decision cannot be overstated. He placed the symbolic weight of France's survival on the shoulders of a teenage girl. Jeanne was not given formal military command. She did not design strategies or formations. Her role was symbolic, spiritual, and psychological. But symbols matter, especially in war. She carried a banner, not a sword. She insisted that soldiers confess their sins, attend Mass, and abandon prostitutes and gambling. She framed the war not as politics, but as divine justice. And something extraordinary happened. Morale changed. French soldiers who had been demoralized and resigned to defeat began to believe they were fighting under God's favor. The English, on the other hand, were deeply unsettled. Rumors spread that Jeanne was a witch, a demon, or an instrument of the devil. Her very presence disrupted the mental balance of the battlefield. During the siege of Orléans, Jeanne was wounded by an arrow. She was carried away, bleeding in pain. Many assumed she would retreat. She did not. She returned to the field the same day. This moment became legendary, not because of tactical brilliance, but because it solidified her image as invincible, a girl who bled but did not break, a messenger of God who could not be silenced by pain. Within days, the French broke the siege. Orléans was liberated. For the first time in years, France had not merely survived, it had won. Jeanne d'Arc became a symbol overnight, not just a hero, but a problem, because symbols do not belong to themselves. The nobility used her to legitimize Charles's rule. The church tolerated her because she reinforced religious authority. The common people projected their hopes onto her. And Jeanne herself believed sincerely that she was fulfilling God's will. But the more powerful she became, the more dangerous she was. She pushed Charles to be crowned at Reims, a city deep in enemy-controlled territory. Logic said it was impossible. Jeanne said it was necessary. And once again, against reason, it happened. Charles was crowned king in July 1429, with Jeanne standing beside him, holding her banner. At that moment, Jeanne reached the peak of her influence, and from that moment on, everything began to unravel. Because once a miracle has served its purpose, institutions no longer protect it. They contain it. Jeanne wanted to continue fighting. She wanted to drive the English completely out of France. But Charles hesitated. Politics returned. Alliances shifted. Jeanne was no longer needed as urgently. She was still useful, but she was no longer essential. And that distinction would cost her everything. Her capture was not dramatic at first. In 1430, during a skirmish near Compiègne, Jeanne was pulled from her horse and taken prisoner by Burgundian forces allied with the English. She had been abandoned. The king she had crowned did not move decisively to rescue her, and the church that had once examined and approved her would soon put her on trial, not for losing a battle, but for existing outside the boundaries she was never meant to cross. Jeanne d'Arc had challenged armies. What she could not survive was authority. Jeanne's imprisonment marked the moment when her story shifted from legend to tragedy. She was not treated as a prisoner of war. She was treated as a threat that needed to be dismantled, carefully, publicly, and permanently. The Burgundians sold her to the English, who understood something crucial: killing. Jeanne on the battlefield would make her a martyr, but destroying her through the church would erase her legitimacy. This is why her trial mattered more than her capture. The English did not want Jeanne dead as a soldier. They wanted her condemned as a heretic. Her trial began in Rouen in early 1431. From the very beginning, it violated almost every standard of church law. Jeanne was denied legal counsel. She was imprisoned in a secular military prison rather than a church prison. She was guarded by English soldiers, not nuns or clergy. The judges were overwhelmingly English or pro-English. The outcome was decided long before the questions were asked. And yet Jeanne did not collapse. She was 19 years old. 19, illiterate, exhausted, injured, isolated, and facing a panel of educated male theologians whose goal was not to understand her, but to trap her. The interrogations were relentless. Day after day, Jeanne was questioned about her visions, her voices, her clothing, her obedience to the church. Every answer was a potential noose. If she claimed her voices came directly from God, she could be accused of bypassing the church, heresy. If she claimed they came through the church, she could be accused of lying. If she denied them, she would betray her own identity. Jeanne walked a narrow path with extraordinary intelligence. When asked whether she was in God's grace, a question no mortal could answer without committing theological error, she famously replied, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." It was a brilliant answer, and it terrified her judges. Again and again, they tried to force her into submission. They demanded that she abandon her men's clothing. This was not about fabric. It was about control. Her clothing represented her autonomy, her refusal to occupy the role assigned to her. Jeanne insisted she wore men's clothes for protection against sexual assault, against humiliation, against vulnerability, and she claimed that God commanded it. This, more than her military actions, sealed her fate, because a woman who claims divine authority over her own body is intolerable to institutions built on obedience. Eventually, under immense pressure, Jeanne signed a document of abjuration, or something like it. She could not read it. She was told it would spare her life. In exchange, she agreed to renounce her voices and wear women's clothing. For a brief moment, she lived, but the system was not finished with her. Within days, Jeanne was back in men's clothing. Accounts differ on whether she chose it or was forced into it. When her women's clothes were removed, either way, this act allowed the court to declare her a relapsed heretic. And a relapsed heretic could not be spared. On May 30th, 1431, Jeanne d'Arc was led to the marketplace in Rouen. She was tied to a stake. A sermon was preached over her. She asked for a cross. When none was given, a soldier made one from wood and placed it in her hands. Witnesses reported that, as the flames rose, Jeanne called out the name of Jesus repeatedly. She died at 19. Her ashes were thrown into the Seine River, not out of mercy, but to prevent relics from being collected. The English wanted no shrine, no memory, no proof. They failed, because death did not silence Jeanne d'Arc. It amplified her. Years later, the political landscape shifted. Charles VII, the king she had crowned, ordered a retrial. In 1456, Jeanne was declared innocent. The original trial was condemned as corrupt and unjust. But this reversal raises an uncomfortable truth. The same institutions that destroyed Jeanne later sanctified her. She was eventually canonized as a saint in 1920, nearly 5 centuries after her execution. Saint, heretic, witch, virgin, warrior, symbol. Jeanne d'Arc has been all of these, depending on who needed her to be. Her story forces us to confront a disturbing question. What happens to women who speak with certainty in a world that demands their silence? Jeanne was not killed because she lost a battle. She was killed because she refused to obey quietly. Her power did not come from weapons. It came from belief, her own and others. And belief, when it cannot be controlled, becomes dangerous. After Jeanne's death, something unexpected happened. She did not disappear. In fact, she became far more powerful once she was gone. Almost immediately, stories about her began to circulate. Not the careful legal language of the trial records, but emotional symbolic narratives. Jeanne the martyr, Jeanne the innocent, Jeanne betrayed by kings and priests, Her execution, meant to erase her, instead turned her into a wound in the conscience of France. And wounds, unlike victories, do not fade easily. In the years following her death, the war continued. Slowly, unevenly, France regained territory. The English were pushed back. By the time Charles VII felt secure enough to order a retrial, Jeanne was no longer politically dangerous. She was useful again. This retrial, known as the Nullification Trial of 1456, officially declared Jeanne innocent. Her original condemnation was ruled invalid, unjust, and corrupt. Witnesses were called. Villagers from Domremy spoke of her childhood. Soldiers testified to her discipline and faith. Clergy admitted procedural violations. But this rehabilitation was not about justice. It was about narrative control. By clearing Jeanne's name, Charles VII retroactively cleansed his own legitimacy. The girl he had failed to save became proof that his reign had been divinely sanctioned all along. Jeanne was folded neatly into the story of a victorious, unified France. And that is the beginning of the myth. From that moment forward, Jeanne d'Arc stopped being a complex human being and became a symbol, flexible, adaptable, endlessly reusable. Monarchists claimed her as proof of divine right. Republicans claimed her as a symbol of popular resistance. The church claimed her obedience. Nationalists claimed her purity. Feminists claimed her defiance. Each version required removing something essential: her fear, her doubt, her contradictions. The church especially softened her edges. When Jeanne was canonized in 1920, she was presented as obedient, humble, submissive to God's will. The dangerous parts of her story, her defiance of male authority, her refusal to surrender autonomy, her resistance to institutional control were carefully muted. A saint must be safe, but Jeanne was never safe. Modern historians and psychologists have struggled with her visions. Some have proposed epilepsy, schizophrenia, trauma-induced hallucinations. Others argue that such diagnoses impose modern frameworks on medieval experience. In Jeanne's world, visions were not inherently pathological. They were meaningful. They carried authority. What matters is not whether Jeanne's voices were real in a medical sense. What matters is that society responded to them as a threat. And this is where Jeanne d'Arc becomes deeply modern, because her story is not really about medieval warfare or religion. It is about who gets to speak with authority and who is punished for doing so. Jeanne was young. She was poor. She was female. She was uneducated. Everything about her positioned her to be silent. And yet, she spoke as if she were certain. That certainty is what frightened people most. In feminist readings, Jeanne is often celebrated as a proto-feminist figure, a woman who broke gender norms, wore men's clothing, led armies, and defied male authority. But this interpretation is both powerful and incomplete. Jeanne did not fight for women's rights. She did not challenge patriarchy consciously. She believed in hierarchy, just one in which God spoke directly to her. This is what makes her so unsettling. She did not seek equality. She claimed exception. And systems can tolerate demands for equality far more easily than they can tolerate claims of divine exception. Jeanne's clothing remains one of the most politically charged aspects of her story. Even today, debates continue over why she wore men's clothes and why she returned to them after her abjuration. The trial records obsess over this detail. Not her battles, not her victories, her clothing, because clothing was the visible sign that she refused to be contained. In many ways, Jeanne's execution was a form of social correction. It was a warning, a message sent through fire. This is what happens when a woman steps outside her assigned role and refuses to return. And yet, the warning failed. Artists, writers, and filmmakers have been unable to let her go. From medieval chansons to modern cinema, Jeanne reappears again and again, sometimes as a holy innocent, sometimes as a nationalist icon, sometimes as a tragic madwoman, sometimes as a feminist rebel. Each generation remakes her, because each generation needs her for something different. In times of war, she becomes a warrior. In times of political crisis, a patriot. In times of cultural upheaval, a symbol of resistance. But beneath all these layers, there is a quieter, more disturbing Jeanne, a teenager who believed so deeply in her inner voice that she was willing to die rather than deny it. That kind of conviction unsettles us, not because it belongs to the past, but because it still exists. People who speak with absolute certainty are still celebrated when they serve power and destroyed when they challenge it. Jeanne d'Arc forces us to ask an uncomfortable question. How do we distinguish faith from fanaticism, conviction from delusion, courage from danger? And perhaps the most unsettling answer is this: sometimes we can't. Jeanne d'Arc's psychology is where her story becomes most uncomfortable and most revealing, because once you remove armor, banners, saints, and myths, what remains is a mind that refused to bend. Jeanne's inner world was structured around certainty, not confidence, not hope, certainty. Her voices did not suggest, they commanded. They did not debate, they instructed, and Jeanne did not experience them as internal thoughts. She experienced them as external authoritative presences. Modern psychology struggles here because we are trained to distrust certainty that does not come from evidence. But medieval spirituality was built differently. In Jeanne's world, certainty did not come from logic. It came from conviction aligned with divine order. And yet, even within that context, Jeanne was extreme. Most mystics doubted themselves. They feared illusion. They questioned their worthiness. Jeanne did not. She questioned others instead. This reversal of doubt is crucial. Jeanne did not ask, "Am I chosen?" She asked, "Why are you resisting what God has already decided?" That mindset is not passive. It is confrontational. Her identity was not something she discovered. It was something she inhabited completely. Jeanne did not become the Maid of Orleans gradually. Once she accepted her mission, she was the mission. This fusion of self and purpose made her powerful and doomed. Because when identity and belief become indistinguishable, compromise becomes impossible. Throughout her trial, Jeanne was offered survival in exchange for obedience. Not silence, obedience. She could live if she agreed that the church, not her voices, had final authority. She refused, even when she briefly recanted. Even when she signed what she could not read, she returned to her truth. Not because she wanted to die, but because living without her inner authority was not living at all. This is where Jeanne stops being a religious figure and becomes a psychological one. She represents the terrifying possibility that a person can be so aligned with their inner voice that no external system can control them, and systems exist to control. This is why Jeanne is not just a story about faith. She is a story about power and the limits of institutional authority. Her judges were not threatened by her beliefs. They were threatened by her independence from them. The church could tolerate visions. The monarchy could tolerate symbols. What neither could tolerate was a young woman who claimed direct access to truth. And this pattern is not medieval. Throughout history, people who speak with absolute inner authority are celebrated only when their certainty reinforces existing power structures. When it disrupts them, it is labeled madness, heresy, extremism. Jeanne's voices were not dangerous because they existed. They were dangerous because they could not be overridden. This is why her trial focused obsessively on obedience. Over and over, she was asked whether she would submit to the church militant, the institutional church on earth. Her answers were careful but revealing. She agreed to obey the church as long as it did not contradict God. That, as long as, was unforgivable, because institutions demand unconditional submission. Jeanne's story also forces us to confront how societies treat young women with certainty. Youth is expected to doubt. Women are expected to defer. Jeanne did neither. She did not perform humility convincingly enough. She did not soften her language. She did not apologize for existing loudly. Even her tears were framed as manipulation. And when she showed strength, it was framed as arrogance. This double bind remains painfully familiar. If a woman believes too strongly, she is dangerous. If she doubts, she is weak. If she speaks, she is disruptive. If she is silent, she is erased. Jeanne chose disruption, and disruption historically is punished. What makes Jeanne d'Arc endure is not that she was right or wrong. It is that she refused to surrender authorship of her own meaning. Her death was meant to end her voice. Instead, it multiplied it. Every retelling of her story is an attempt to answer the same unresolved question. What do we do with people, especially women, who believe themselves absolutely? Do we sanctify them? Diagnose them? Silence them? Follow them? Jeanne offers no comfort here. She offers a mirror, and what we see reflected in it depends entirely on how much certainty frightens us. Jeanne d'Arc does not belong to the past. She keeps returning because modernity never resolved the problem she represents. In the centuries after her death, Jeanne was repeatedly pulled into political battles she never chose. During the French Revolution, she was stripped of her sainthood imagery and reframed as the peasant heroine, a symbol of the people, rising against corrupt elites. Later, conservative forces reclaimed her as a defender of tradition, monarchy, and divine order. In the 20th century, nationalist movements used her image to define true Frenchness, often excluding immigrants, minorities, and dissenters in her name. The same girl, radically different meanings. This is the danger of symbols. They can be emptied and refilled endlessly. Jeanne becomes especially powerful in moments of crisis. When nations feel threatened, they look for figures who embody purity, sacrifice, and certainty. Jeanne offers all three. She is young, uncontaminated by compromise. She dies before disillusionment can touch her. She never adapts, and that makes her perfect for myth. But myth comes at a cost. The more Jeanne is mythologized, the less space there is for her humanity. Popular culture reflects this tension. In films and literature, Jeanne is often portrayed either as a fragile, wholly innocent, or as a fierce, almost supernatural warrior. Rarely is she allowed to be confused, frightened, or contradictory. Ambiguity weakens icons, and yet, ambiguity is where truth lives. Modern audiences are especially fascinated by Jeanne's voices. In a secular age, we are less comfortable with divine explanation, but no less obsessed with inner authority. Jeanne's voices are often reinterpreted as intuition, trauma, destiny, or psychological divergence. She becomes a metaphor for listening to oneself, for trusting an inner compass even when the world says you are wrong. But this interpretation is not entirely comforting, because it asks a difficult question. What if the inner voice is wrong? Jeanne forces us to confront the limits of individual conviction. We admire her courage, but we are uneasy with her certainty. We celebrate authenticity, but only up to the point where it disrupts order. This tension plays out constantly in modern society. Whistleblowers, radical thinkers, young activists, women who refuse to soften their language. They are praised as long as they remain symbolic and punished the moment they become effective. Jeanne's story also resonates deeply in discussions about gender and power. She did not challenge patriarchy by asking permission. She walked directly through it, claiming authority that was never offered. Her punishment was not subtle. It was spectacular. Public execution has always been about more than death. It is theater. It teaches the audience how to behave. Jeanne's execution taught women what happens when they refuse containment, and yet containment failed. because Jeanne's refusal echoes louder than her obedience ever could have. In psychological terms, Jeanne represents an identity that is internally sourced rather than externally validated. This is profoundly destabilizing to hierarchical systems. If legitimacy comes from within, institutions lose their monopoly on meaning. That is why Jeanne remains uncomfortable. She cannot be fully absorbed. Even sainthood did not tame her. The church canonized her body, but not her defiance. Nationalism claimed her image, but not her refusal to submit. Feminism celebrates her courage, but struggles with her absolutism. She resists clean categories. Perhaps that is why she endures. Because Jeanne d'Arc is not a solution. She is a question that refuses to close. What do we do with those who believe too much? Not those who doubt, not those who hesitate, but those who move forward as if the world must make room for them. Jeanne did not ask whether she was allowed. She assumed necessity, and necessity is terrifying. As long as societies depend on obedience, Jeanne d'Arc will remain dangerous, not as a saint or a warrior, but as a reminder that authority can be claimed, not granted. She stands at the intersection of faith, madness, courage, and control, and refuses to move aside. That is why her story is never finished. Jeanne d'Arc's story becomes darkest when we confront the subject. Most narratives avoid violence, not symbolic violence, not institutional violence, but real blood, real deaths, real bodies. Jeanne is often remembered as a pure figure, the virgin, the saint, the innocent girl guided by God, and yet she stood at the center of war. She rode into battles. She encouraged armies. She helped sustain a conflict in which thousands died. This creates a moral tension that is rarely addressed honestly. How do we reconcile innocence with participation in violence? Jeanne herself insisted that she did not kill. She carried a banner, not a sword. She claimed she hated bloodshed. And there is truth here. She did not personally execute prisoners or engage in hand-to-hand slaughter, but moral distance does not erase moral involvement. Jeanne believed the war was just because God willed it. This belief transformed violence into obedience. Killing became purification. Destruction became righteousness. This is the most dangerous idea human beings have ever invented. Not violence itself, but sanctified violence. Once violence is framed as sacred, it becomes immune to doubt. Jeanne's certainty removed hesitation. French soldiers believed they were instruments of divine justice. English soldiers believed they were facing something unnatural, not just an enemy, but a force. Fear escalated. Brutality followed. This does not make Jeanne uniquely guilty. It makes her deeply human. Throughout history, people who believe they act under divine authority are capable of extraordinary courage and extraordinary cruelty. Jeanne exists at that fault line, and this is why modern societies struggle with her. Because we want heroes without consequences. We want purity without blood. We want conviction without harm. Jeanne offers none of these comforts. Her belief system did not allow for moral ambiguity. The English were not opponents, they were wrong. They were occupying land that God had designated. Resistance to them was not negotiation, it was correction. This absolutism is emotionally powerful and ethically terrifying. When Jeanne told soldiers to confess their sins before battle, she was not preparing them for peace. She was preparing them for death, their own, or someone else's. Confession cleansed the soul so the body could be sacrificed. This is the logic of holy war. And holy war does not end when one side wins. It reshapes how people understand killing itself. Jeanne's legacy forces us to ask, is conviction still admirable when it removes compassion? The uncomfortable answer is that conviction often requires exactly that. One of the reasons Jeanne remains culturally safe is that her violence is usually softened or erased. Films focus on her suffering, not the suffering of those who died because the war continued. Her youth shields her. Her gender disarms criticism, But moral responsibility does not disappear because someone is young, sincere, or oppressed. Jeanne believed she was right. So did many others who committed terrible acts throughout history. This does not mean Jeanne was evil. It means she was dangerous, and danger is not always malicious. Sometimes it comes wrapped in purity. Jeanne's execution, ironically, allowed her to escape this moral reckoning. Death froze her in time. She did not live long enough to become compromised, to negotiate, to retreat, to question. She did not survive long enough to disappoint us. That is part of her power. Had she lived into adulthood, had she navigated politics, had she made compromises, her myth would be weaker. Certainty rarely survives longevity. In this sense, Jeanne is preserved by her destruction. Her death allows us to mourn her without fully confronting the violence she enabled. And yet, if we want to understand her honestly, we cannot separate her faith from its consequences. Jeanne d'Arc is not just a story about courage. She is a story about what happens when belief becomes unquestionable. This is her darkest legacy, and perhaps her most relevant one, because the world has not moved beyond holy war. We have only changed the language. Ideology replaces God. Nation replaces heaven. Identity replaces salvation. But the structure remains the same. Those who believe absolutely still justify harm. Those who doubt are still dismissed as weak. Jeanne stands at the origin of this pattern, not because she invented it, but because she embodies it with terrifying clarity. She forces us to confront a truth we resist. Absolute certainty, even when it feels righteous, carries blood on its hands. Jeanne d'Arc's legacy does not offer closure. It offers responsibility. After everything, the visions, the victories, the trial, the fire, we are left not with answers, but with a choice. How do we remember her without turning her into something harmless? The temptation is always the same: to sanctify, to simplify, to soften. But Jeanne resists this. If we remember her only as a saint, we erase her defiance. If we remember her only as a victim, we erase her agency. If we remember her only as a nationalist icon, we erase her danger. To remember Jeanne honestly, we must hold all of it at once. She was brave. She was uncompromising. She was sincere. She was violent by consequence. She was young. She was certain. And certainty is never neutral. Jeanne teaches us something deeply uncomfortable about power. It does not always come from institutions. Sometimes it comes from conviction, so complete that others begin to reorganize themselves around it. This kind of power is unstable. It cannot be regulated. It cannot be predicted. It cannot be recalled once unleashed. That is why institutions fear it, and why people are drawn to it. Jeanne did not wait for permission to matter. She did not negotiate her legitimacy. She behaved as if meaning flowed through her, not toward her. This is intoxicating to watch, and dangerous to follow. In a world that increasingly encourages individuals to trust their truth, Jeanne's story stands as a warning as much as an inspiration. Inner authority can liberate, but it can also blind. Listening to oneself is powerful, but without doubt, it becomes domination. Jeanne had no doubt, and that is both her greatness and her tragedy. Her execution did not end her influence. It multiplied it because unresolved stories echo longer than resolved ones. Jeanne died without reconciliation, without apology, without retreat. She did not learn. She did not soften. She did not adapt. She burned exactly as she lived, certain. And perhaps that is why we still speak her name. Because in a world built on compromise, she represents the terrifying purity of belief. Not purity as goodness, but purity as refusal. Refusal to bend. Refusal to doubt. Refusal to disappear quietly. Jeanne d'Arc does not ask us to admire her. She asks us to examine ourselves. Where do we place our certainty? Who do we trust with authority? What voices do we follow and why? And perhaps most importantly, what do we do when conviction becomes more powerful than compassion? There is no final lesson here, only a mirror held steady across centuries. Jeanne d'Arc stands in that mirror, not as a saint, not as a madwoman, not as a heroine, but as a human being who believed completely. And belief, once complete, cannot be undone. That is her legacy, and it is not comfortable. As we come to the end of this story, I want to leave you not with answers, but with silence, because some lives are too large to be closed neatly. Jeanne d'Arc does not resolve. She lingers. She lingers in the space between faith and fear, between courage and danger, between obedience and defiance. She was a girl who believed completely, and the world has never quite known what to do with people like that. We are taught to admire conviction from a safe distance. We are taught to celebrate courage after it has been burned, buried, and explained. But in real time, certainty is unsettling. In real time, it disrupts. It challenges comfort. It forces decisions. Jeanne forced decisions. She forced kings to act. She forced soldiers to believe. She forced institutions to reveal their limits. And in the end, she forced the world to show its cruelty. Her death was meant to be an ending. Instead, it became a beginning, not because she was perfect, but because she was uncompromising. Jeanne reminds us that history is not only shaped by those who rule, but by those who refuse to know their place. That power does not always come from armies or crowns. Sometimes it comes from a voice that will not go quiet. And that is terrifying. As you turn this podcast off, carry her carefully, not as a saint to worship, not as a martyr to romanticize, not as a symbol to weaponize. Carry her as a question. What do we do with people who believe too deeply? What do we do with women who speak without permission? What do we do with certainty when it doesn't ask to be approved? And perhaps most importantly, what do we do with our own voices, the ones we soften, delay, or silence because they might cost us something? Jeanne d'Arc paid everything. You are not asked to do that. You are only asked to remember that conviction has weight, that belief has consequences, and that silence is never neutral. Some stories end, others remain. Jeanne remains. Thank you for listening.